It's hard to know as a rabbi what to talk about tonight, I have to say. The Jewish Daily Forward sent out an email 2 weeks ago to ask rabbis to tell them what they were speaking about tonight. And I thought, how could you possibly know in the world we're living 2 weeks in advance what to talk about? First of all, how many of you have developed kind of a gut-wrenching feeling in your stomach every time you see that phrase, breaking news? It's a terrifying thing, this breaking news. So anyway, the Forward published today what all those rabbis, I didn't answer, by the way, what they were going to talk about. So I thought I would give you an overview of what everybody else is talking about. And I'd give you a quick overview and tell you what I thought of these topics, so you could say I talked about all of them too, and then I'll get to my, okay. The biggest topic of all of those, 65 rabbis responded to the Jewish Daily Forward's questionnaire from all over the country. Anti-Semitism. I'm against it. Israel was the second biggest one. Okay, it's a little more nuanced. I'm pro-Israel. I'm against Netanyahu. I think the occupation should end, and I think Israel should live up to its Jewish values of pluralism and democracy with full rights for Palestinians. Okay. Climate change was the third thing. I believe in science. Okay. Next one. Repentance. Yes, it's a good idea. Next topic was optimism. Well, I'm not sure about that one. Then the next topic, interestingly in this list, was breathing. Did you know that the average person breathes 22,000 times a day? Roseanne, is that true? Is it true? All right, well that's, okay, I just taught you something about breathing. Diets. Meditation. Okay, that's important, I think. Who here meditates? Do we have meditators here? See? Meditation's a good thing. I support meditation. Memory. I'm losing mine, really losing mine. Anger. That's a problem in the world in which we live. People are really angry, and all of us have to learn to control our anger more, okay? That's my sermon about anger. Meaning. We all yearn for meaning in our lives, don't we? We have an appetite for meaning as much as we have an appetite for other things, and we need to make room for meaning. Waiting, patience. Oof, that's hard. Faith. We need faith. We really need faith in the world in which we live. And by faith, I don't mean empty believing that somebody else or some other power is going to come in and save us. Because guess what? That is not what happens in the real world. God does not swoop down and save us. There is no Superman. There is no Batman. And by the way, all those characters were created by two Jewish boys in the 1930s who were desperate for a golem to come in and save us as a people. It's not the real world. We have to save ourselves. And here's what I have to say about that. If you haven't been really actively engaged in the world in which we live in this last year, there's nobody else coming to save you. If all you've been doing is screaming at Rachel Maddow or Wolf Blitzer, it's not good enough. Turn off the TV and figure out something you can do. And if you can't figure it out on your own, my email is rabbi@cbst.org, and I will help you figure it out. Okay? And that's what faith is about. Faith is about believing in the possibility of a future. An understanding that there will be a future. How that future looks has a lot to do with what we do. And guess what, folks? I got some really bad news to tell you. Our people have lived through much worse times in other generations, and there are people living through much worse times in other places in the world. We have to stop feeling sorry for ourselves and figure out how we're going to join together and do something about the world in which we live. Every single one of us. And I'm telling you something. There's no guarantee it's going to get better in our lifetimes. I want you to start preparing for that. As much as so many of us are looking at St. Nancy Pelosi and imagining There's going to be some liberation. We are not in this moment in history because of a fluke. It is a global phenomenon of nationalism and populism and anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And we have to do a lot to change the world. And it's a big job. It's a huge job. But I have a really important rabbinic secret to tell you. You know how book people tell novelists that every writer has one novel in them? I've heard that. I'm not a writer and I'm not a book person. I mean, I'm a book person. I read, but I'm not, you know what I mean. You know that saying that a novelist has one great novel in them and the others are? Rabbis have one sermon. And here's my sermon. Joy is an act of spiritual and political resistance. Despair is not an option. Nobody is coming to save us but us. Acting in the world as if we understand that is what God wants of us, whether or not you believe in God, will bring holiness to the world. The world is full of ugliness. It is full of evil. And our job, as much as fetching is really fun, our job is, as Heschel said, to be as good as the fascists are evil. To be as good as the fascists are evil. If that is our standard. And here's the other thing that's a piece of this. We cannot be only doing it for our own satisfaction. We are doing it for the future. You have to ask yourself every single morning, what will the future say about how you spent today? What will the children in 50 years say about who you were and what you did today in the world in which we live? That's why we're trying to build a synagogue community in which the future, or God, whichever way you understand it, will look back on us and say, we did everything we could with how many breaths? 22,000 breaths a day to make the world something we believed in. We didn't measure success by what we could see. You know the story about the guy in the Talmud who's found planting a carob tree, and somebody comes along and says to him, what are you doing, you nutnik? You're an old man. The carob tree takes 70 years to bear fruit. Why would you plant a tree from which you will never eat? And the man says, somebody planted a tree from which I'm eating. I don't even know who that person is. I have to plant the tree that will bear fruit in future generations. And that is what we have to do now in the world in which we live. No matter what happens, despair is not an option. It simply is not. It's an excuse to bury ourselves under the covers, as fun as that can be, and we've all done it. We have to find ways to know that we've done everything our 22,000 breaths a day allow us to do. No one can do everything. Everyone can do something. There was a famous group, not famous at the time, but famous now, a small group of a few medical students. Some of you might have heard of them, called the White Rose during Nazi Germany. These were all Aryan, German medical students. They weren't at all at risk by what the Nazis were doing. They could have completed their medical training, become doctors, made a nice living. There were no Jews anymore in the towns in which they lived and in the universities in which they studied. And these medical students who were religious people, two of them were a brother and a sister that you might have heard of. Sophie Schott was 21 years old. And they tried to figure out what they could do about what they saw going on in their country and what they saw their relatives and their classmates and their neighbors engaged in. And they said, okay, we're kind of nerdy intellectuals. Well, what can we do is we could write leaflets, and we could distribute leaflets. And maybe those leaflets will inspire somebody who could do something else. They didn't say to themselves, the leaflets will not overthrow the Nazis. They said to themselves, what could they do? So they secretly wrote leaflets. It was almost impossible to get paper. or a machine on which to make copies, and typewriters were totally impossible to find, but they did all of those things, and they wrote documents, 7 leaflets in all, that described what was going on in truthful, factual way. And they distributed these letters all over. They sent them by mail. They put them on. They dropped them in the streets. And the idea was this was what they could do. They were captured by the Nazis. A janitor turned them in when they saw the young girl throwing some of the papers down an atrium in the university, and they were executed. 21 years old, Sophie said, "One has to do something in order to not be guilty oneself." These letters, by the way, these leaflets are so powerful to read now. Sophie, 21 years old, had no idea that me, a Jew, a lesbian, in 2019 New York City, would read the leaflets that this group wrote in 1941 and 1942. But I read those leaflets and I'm so deeply moved by what they did. Some are overwhelmed and paralyzed in the world in which we're finding ourselves right now and don't know what to do. And some of us are exhausted from over-involvement. How do we act in the world in which we live? The Rambam, Maimonides, said very famously that we have to act in the world all the time as if the world is in an extremely delicate balance at every minute. One good deed can tip that balance. And nobody knows whose deed it will be that will tip the balance. Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, the rabbi of Lubavitch, would say frequently, every act of kindness is like antibiotics that are thrown in to neutralize viruses of hate. Every act of kindness is like an antibiotic that is neutralizing viruses of hate. And our job is to germinate the world with holiness. Wow, that's a different measure of success. So the measure of success can't be, we will absolutely be able to turn the tide and change the world and liberate all those who are enslaved peoples and transform all that is wrong into being all that is right. Because guess what? You can give up pretty quickly because the measure of success is so difficult. But if the measure of success is that in a given day, we have contributed more kindness and done more acts of justice to neutralize the virus of evil in the world, then we could feel like we are contributing to the universe. Asur lehityaesh. It is forbidden to despair as a Jewish tradition. Be the reason somebody believes in the goodness of somebody, goodness of people. A famous story is told, and some of you might know it, of somebody who stood on a soapbox in the middle of a busy, crowded city, shouting at people to change, to become good, to look for kindness and justice. And somebody walks by and says, "What are you doing? Don't you notice no one is listening to you? Why do you keep doing this?" And the person says, "Well, I keep doing this because I really want to make sure that I am doing everything I can to change everyone around me." So at the end of the day, the same person walks by, the same person's up on the soapbox, saying the same things, nobody's paying any attention. And the person says, "No, Nudnik, all right, you've been here all day shouting what you're shouting, saying what you're saying. Nobody's listening to you." So the person says, "In the morning, I started out doing this because I wanted to change everyone else. Now I'm doing it because I want to make sure I don't change myself, that I don't lose sight of what I care about, what's valuable to me, and I don't become like everybody else." Sometimes that is a justification for what we have to do. Mordechai says to Esther, and many of you have heard me say some of these things in the course of this year. Mordechai says to Esther in the book of Esther, when she's not sure she should come out, she's married, remember, the king. She's doing quite well. She's living in the palace, full of luxury and resources and staff and everything, food. And Mordecai says, Esther, now is the time for you to come out as a Jew. Now's the time. All right, you've got to now sacrifice everything and come out as a Jew now. And Mordecai says to Esther, and Esther clearly is resisting that idea. I mean, right? Who wants to give up that? And Mordecai says, it is for this time, maybe, that you were created. I believe this is true for all of us in this room, and you've heard this from me before. The world is shattered. It is up to us to keep bringing in holiness, to believe deeply that we are partners with God in creating more and more holiness no matter what. And that if you are alive today, it is because, and this is where faith comes in, there is something that you have to offer that the world desperately needs. And don't complain that you're alive through difficult times. Appreciate that you have something, and only you are going to be able to figure out exactly what that is, but you've got to put one foot in front of the other. Our people have suffered terribly in the past, much worse than it is right now, and we do not know what the future will bring. And we live in a time of terrible uncertainty, but we know this. We are alive now. We don't know for how long, and we don't know at what health. But everyone has a gift that God has given them to offer this universe. No one is coming to save us, but God is with us. And if we act in a way in which we understand that, whether or not you believe in God, and as you know, I say this all the time, I believe in God, but I do not believe in a God who cares whether or not you believe in God. But I believe in the power of our acts of love and of kindness and of justice. Many of you know the stories of us standing by the mosque every Friday, and many of you in this room have done it on some Fridays. Some come for a couple of Fridays a year, some come every week, some come for a short amount of time. Everyone in this room is welcome. 238 Thompson Street, every Friday from 12:45 to 2:30. Try and figure out one Friday you could do this, to stand in front of that mosque and get the experience of Muslims who let us remember the President of the United States started his campaign for presidency with an anti-Muslim speech. We stand there and we are showered with love. Excuse me, with thanks. And as you know, Muslims are here today to help us create holiness. Do the thing that you can do. And if you can't figure out alone what it is to do it, I'm here to help. That's what being part of a community is. The world is shattered. It is up to us to bring in the holiness. Each of you is full of holiness. Each of us has something the world so desperately needs to repair it. And we have to become deeper than the fast food culture of America, which we've all, in some level, reflect. Change won't necessarily come in our lifetime in a way that reflects our deepest values. But we can build the foundation for the future. Some can ask, how on Rosh Hashanah can we do this work of personal, individual tshuva, of repentance, given the nature of evil that exists in the world today? Does it matter how good or bad I am? Isn't it so small compared to what's going on in the world around us? And this is exactly the power of Rosh Hashanah. It matters how we live our lives, no matter what goes on elsewhere. It's easy to say, well, compared to what's going on in this universe, I'm a pretty good person, you know? What do I need to do tshuva for? They're the ones that need to do tshuva. Come on, let's talk about Stephen Miller. What's he doing this Yontif? But here's the story. And this is really hard sometimes. It doesn't really matter. what's happening with somebody else. What matters is your accepting you are created in the image of God, and to figure out what ways you are going to keep living up to that. What changes do you need to make for this coming year? What relationships do you need to work on? How do you need to transform the things that you do that you know take away from the holiness in your life? And what are the things you can do to change those things? Even in the world in which we live, you have that power. So let us together move through these days of awe. Let us remember that we yearn for meaning, that we yearn for purpose, and we have the opportunity to have both in such depth. Please, God, let us live one thing that I ask. We say throughout this season, one thing I pray for is to be in the presence of God every single day. To understand our role is a role of increasing holiness in the world and decreasing evil, of spreading light and decreasing the darkness.